So we're back with the question, did Jesus exist? Well, yes. Now, I'm the Curious Christian. I'm a former mythicist who's looking at the claims of mythicists, or something like that. So we were looking at a video by Paulogia, which has the Godless Engineer on it. And in the last one, we kind of discussed the idea of Philo and a little bit about Paul, but this one will be getting more into Paul, so let's just roll the clip right off.
Paul clearly separates himself from any historical source concerning the gospel of Jesus in Galatians 1:11.
So this is one of my least favorite arguments. So when we are talking about the gospel that Paul proclaimed, we're not talking about a gospel similar to our biblical gospels. We're not talking about Paul's view in general. The letters of Paul and much of his thinking in general would not be considered part of his gospel. At a most basic level, gospel here means good news. This good news, as per Paul, centered around Jesus being the Messiah and the redemption or salvation that entailed. It in no way suggests that Paul is saying that he received no information about Jesus or is developing theology from anyone else. He's specifically referring to one small aspect. Now, we do have to be careful here, as Paul does not fully define what was in his gospel. A large part of that is because he's not telling us his gospel. He's not recording it in his letters. This gospel is something that he preaches publicly, something he uses to bring people into the movement. This precedes his actual letter writing, where he's answering questions and addressing issues that are being brought up later. This is important because that one statement in Galatians does not mean that Paul didn't receive any information from others. He's not saying that. And in fact, when we look through Paul, he tells us the opposite. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 11:1-2, Paul speaks of the tradition that he's handed down. These traditions precede Paul. One of those traditions is actually mentioned just a few chapters later in 1 Corinthians 15:3, where he talks about what he received and then passed on, which is the Passion narrative. More so, if we circle back to Galatians 1 and look at verse 18, we are told that Paul went and spent 15 days with Cephas, or Peter. The term used here is historo. While it can be used in a sense of to visit, it tends to mean more than that, such as to become acquainted with, or to learn from, or to gain knowledge from. This highly suggests that Paul went to visit Peter for a course of 15 days, not to idly chat about the weather, but to learn from him. The idea that Paul didn't learn from anyone else or claim to have learned from no one simply isn't what is being said in Galatians 1. That's a gross misreading.
Paul claims that Jesus Christ is the firstborn Son of God, which is in Romans 8:29, the celestial image of God, which is in 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, which is in 1 Corinthians 8:6.
The argument that Godless is attempting to make here is toast before it even begins. He's building it upon a very faulty foundation. Worse though, his argument hinges on a massive pivot. Prior to this, he's been discussing Philo and the concept of the Logos. He attempts to conflate the Logos with the Messiah, but Philo doesn't do that. He then uses this conflation to argue that Paul has a similar viewpoint. The problem here should be obvious. The Logos and the Messiah are not the same. You can't make an argument in regards to the development of the Logos and then conflate that with Messianic ideals. That is a leap. Paul does not develop a Logos theology and appears to be unaware of Philo's philosophy, or if he had any familiarity with it, it's not something he adopted in any significant manner. Thus, in this case, drawing a similarity between Philo and Paul makes very little sense. And if the argument is simply some Jews were thinking in such a way, it still doesn't mean much. Unless one can show an actual connection, then this line of reasoning doesn't get one very far. Another problem, though, is that, as we previously saw, a number of Jewish concepts get incorporated into Philo's Logos theology. So we see a connection between the Logos and Sophia. This does come into some Pauline theology, but only because he's borrowing from the same framework, from the same pool of ideas. So let's actually dive into these three verses then. Romans 8:28-29 certainly speaks of Jesus as the Son of God, but what here makes Jesus the firstborn? Simply the resurrection. Jesus was justified and glorified through the resurrection. This is a reference to the idea of a general resurrection. Paul makes this case elsewhere in 1 Corinthians 15, 20-23. There, Paul speaks of Jesus as being the first fruit. In both cases, the idea is the same. Jesus is to be the first who's resurrected, which will kick off the general resurrection. In this context then, in Romans, Jesus becomes the firstborn, as he's the first to be resurrected. But Paul makes it clear he will not be the only one who's resurrected, because Jesus is only the first among many brothers. Again, referencing the general resurrection. So that manner that Paul is using this idea is rather different from how Philo uses it. Moving to 2 Corinthians 4:4, we do have Christ, or Jesus, being in the image of God. This does connect with some views that Philo had of the Logos, but again, we don't see an actual connection here between Paul and Philo. However, we do see other places where this view is being developed. Most famously, we have the creation stories in Genesis, where it is said that humans are made in the image of God. We can be quite certain that Paul had the Genesis account in mind when he's speaking of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15, we see Paul building up this comparison with Adam. It is in this idea of Adam that Paul places Jesus. While the Adam in Genesis is the first Adam, Jesus will be the last Adam. Now, even though Adam would have been made in the image of God, Jesus is a more perfect image. With Adam, we all die, but with Jesus, we are all made alive. With Adam, the image of God has been marred, but with Jesus, that image is once again restored. Paul builds up this two-Adam framework in order to contrast between fallen humanity and risen humanity. So again, while we have broad similarity here, with Philo calling the Logos the image of God and Paul calling Christ the image of God, the manner that such ideas are applied are vastly different. Finally, we get to 1 Corinthians 8:6, where Jesus is described more or less as an agent of creation. Does this relate to Philo's Logos theology, though? No. Again, we have no real connection between Paul and Philo. Since we see no connection there, we should see if maybe these ideas could have come from somewhere else. And it turns out that yes, we can point to another source. That source is one that we know Paul used, the Hebrew Bible, where we see the concept of the Spirit of God. It is this Spirit in Genesis 1:2 that hovers over the waters during creation. It is this Spirit that, according to Psalms 33:6, we see creation happening. In fact, if we look at any of these passages, we see Paul using language reserved for the Spirit of God. And this connection here is one that we know existed, as Paul, again, cites Hebrew scriptures. Further, though, these three concepts were not attached to Messianic ideas. As we already discussed, for Philo, these ideas were connected to the Logos, not to a Messiah figure. Within Second Temple Judaism, we do not see these ideas attached to the Messiah. What's striking about Paul is that he's taking ideas generally reserved for God, such as views surrounding the Spirit of God, and attaches them to Jesus. This is not Messianic ideology, but something different.
Separately from Paul, but contemporary to him, Hebrews records that Jesus is God's celestial high priest.
So I'm not really sure why Hebrews is tossed in here. Yes, if you toss a net out further, you can pick up more similarities, but at the same time, those similarities become less meaningful. If we could find a dozen individuals who all had different beliefs, but all of those beliefs happen to line up with one person specific, that doesn't mean anything. This seems like a deceptive tactic at best, and really should have been left out, especially since it poses issues for Godless's case. First, the idea of a high priest is not a Messianic idea. Philo does not attach it to Messianic thinking, and in general, we don't see this view being attached to the Messiah. Now, we can give some leeway here, as there are some small groups at this time that had views that were somewhat similar. For instance, we have evidence that some believed that there would be two Messianic figures, one taking a priestly role and the other a kingly role, but the similarity is pretty weak. Second, and most importantly here, is that Hebrews 4:14-15 actually places Jesus here on earth. they make it clear that Jesus was human here on earth, and that is central to the claim being made in Hebrews. Verse 14 here tells us clearly that Jesus had to ascend into the heavens, which implies an ascent from earth. Now, one could translate this verse as saying that Jesus passed through the heavens, which may lead credence to the idea that all of this is taking place in a celestial realm, but you still have to read such a concept into the passage. But this possibility is stripped away when we actually read the next verse, verse 15, which states, quote, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin." Unquote. For Jesus to be tested as we have been, that means he was human, a human here on earth. This idea is also mentioned in Hebrews 2:14 and Hebrews 5:7, which both speak of the flesh of Jesus, his human aspect. Hebrews 13:12 also firmly places Jesus here on earth when it states that he suffered outside of the city gate. All of this clearly portrays Jesus as having a flesh and blood body here on earth, where he died just outside of Jerusalem, and that only later did he ascend into heaven. So not only does this not relate to Philo or to the Messiah, but instead it makes clear that Jesus was seen as having existed here on earth.
We also have Paul confirming his gospel is the same as the apostles Cephas and James the Pillar.
This point really doesn't mean much. As we have already discussed, the gospel that Paul was speaking about wasn't the entirety of his preaching. It referred to just a small portion of his message, a portion that we don't even necessarily have. So to make a big deal about the fact that Paul's gospel matches that of Cephas, or Peter's, and of James, doesn't really tell us anything. From what we can gather, this gospel was simply in regards to Jesus dying for our sins, that he was resurrected as the first fruits of the general resurrection, and this centered around God's justice. In regards to all of this, we do have an eschatological hope, which centers around the Messiah, but it doesn't really dive into what the Messiah is, or the larger aspect about the Messiah. That Paul, Peter, and James all agreed on these basic ideas isn't surprising.
So obviously, Paul and other Jews similar to Paul were also syncretizing Judaism into a new religion that believed the Messiah foretold in the Jewish scriptures had come and absolved sins. Just like with Philo, this follows the trend happening in the area.
This conclusion doesn't follow his argument. As we've already seen, Philo wasn't talking about the Messiah. And while Philo does introduce Platonic thought into his own theology, he primarily did such in order to uncover deeper truths that were already present in Judaism. All of this is irrelevant when it comes to Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Most of what GE covered had nothing to do with actual Messianic thought. Paul wasn't busy describing what the Messiah was thought to be, but instead was relating Jesus with the Spirit of God. And he wasn't getting these ideas from Greek thought, but he was taking them directly from Judaism. There is no need to suppose that there was any syncretism here. Just because we can see Philo blending Jewish ideas with Greek philosophy, we can't assume that was true for all of Judaism. We have to remember that Philo was a diaspora Jew. Christianity began within Palestinian Judaism, which largely resisted Hellenistic thought. But let's move on.
After Paul's epistles, all of the references to Jesus are dependent on Paul's work.
I'm not sure where this notion comes from. Going back to Hebrews, there seems to be no dependency on Paul. The author doesn't cite Paul as an authority. The theology of Hebrews differs from Pauline theology, and the style and vocabulary are markedly different. There is no evidence that Hebrews is dependent on Paul. But maybe GE isn't including Hebrews into this equation, as Hebrews doesn't come after the Pauline epistles. Maybe he's only referring to the Gospels. But even that isn't accepted by any scholar, so let's see where he's going with this.
The Gospels really only have Mark that is somewhat independent, although it heavily relies on Paul's work.
Does Mark rely heavily on Paul? First, let's just point out that just because Mark may have used Paul as a source, it doesn't mean that Mark was dependent on Paul. The fact that GE can say that Mark also is independent tells us that his prior claim was over-exaggerated. Now, it's pretty clear that much of GE's argument is coming from Richard Carrier. Carrier does state that Mark used Paul, but he also states that Mark used many different sources. There are a number of other scholars who have also argued that Paul has some influence on Mark. So the view that Mark used Paul in some manner isn't novel, but we can't place too much emphasis on that. What I find most interesting here, though, is that Mark using Paul as a source is somehow now a negative thing. Wouldn't it be positive, though? After all, wouldn't we want to know that a historian or someone writing about history was using earlier sources? I'd think so. But even if we assume that Mark used Paul, we also have to realize that the vast majority of what Mark is recording does not actually come from Paul. For instance, never does Paul state Jesus was from Nazareth, but Mark clearly does. Paul has very few sayings from Jesus, yet Mark includes quite a few. Paul doesn't discuss what Jesus did for a living, yet Mark tells us that he was a carpenter. We also see a lack of distinct Pauline terms within Mark, as well as a difference of view when it comes to the Torah. Another issue here is that many of the supposed parallels that scholars mention between Paul and Mark most likely would have been mentioned regardless. For instance, both Paul and Mark discuss the passion of Jesus. They go over the death and resurrection of Jesus, and that they attach some sort of atonement on all of this. But this sort of parallel should be expected. Not only does Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:3 specifically state that he himself received the information about the death and resurrection, meaning that there was already a source for this information, but if Jesus existed, this story would be of the utmost importance. So anyone writing a bio of Jesus would have certainly included it. This raises another point. Both Paul and Mark were part of the same movement, a movement that was dealing with a number of issues. They most likely would have been sharing from the same informational pool, which would have included oral traditions, early hymns, and creeds, as well as scriptural interpretations that were applied to Jesus. There is also the possibility that Mark couldn't have been influenced by Paul, as maybe Mark was authored in the 40s, a decade before Paul's letters were being written. Scholars like James Crossley and Maurice Casey both make convincing arguments that Mark was written around 40 AD, based on their interpretation of Mark 13 relating to the Caligula crisis. Even if we ignore that possibility, we still lack direct evidence that Mark used Paul as a source. And even if we assume that yes, Mark did use Paul, we still have to realize that Paul would have been just a single source. After all, the vast majority of what is in Mark is not to be found within Paul.
All the other Gospels copied off Mark.
This is simply wrong. Mythicists often make this sort of claim, and I find it rather interesting. They seem to demean the Gospels for using sources, but is that not exactly what we want? After all, it's what historians do. So why is this a negative? It could be that they phrase it in a dishonest manner. Instead of stating that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, they instead claim that they were simply copying Mark. The idea that the Gospel writers were copying others is misleading at best. Yes, Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. They don't cite Mark properly, but as historians, we don't expect proper citations during this time period. Often, the way that we know that someone used a source is because we have the source that they used, and they clearly used that source word for word. Or if we don't have a source that was used, we can sometimes see that the author's style has changed a bit, that their language is different, which may suggest that they were using a source. Meaning, what we see with the Synoptic Gospels is not unique. More than that, anyone who reads Matthew and Luke can clearly see that there's a lot of material that is just not found in Mark. This should tell us that they aren't simply copying Mark. We also see that Matthew and Luke have shared material that is not found in Mark. This suggests one of a few possibilities. The more favored view among scholars is that both Matthew and Luke use some other shared source that we no longer have. This source is often referred to as Q. It's a hypothetical gospel as we don't actually have copies of it, but it seems to make sense of the data. And to be clear, Q isn't unique here, as hypothetical documents are proposed at various times. Another possible solution here is that Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew and possibly also Mark. While this is a view that isn't as supported and there are some major flaws with it, it still highlights that at least one of the Gospels was utilizing multiple prior sources. In fact, the author of Luke even tells us that there were a variety of prior sources, and the implication is that he utilized them in order to give a more full account. Regardless of how one solves the issue of the shared information between Matthew and Luke, we also have unique material in both Matthew and Luke. Often scholars will label this as the M source or the L source, but largely what they are referring to is just the special material in both, not that they're actual sources. Now, it is possible that some of this unique material is just made up by either author, but if we take Luke seriously, it may mean that this unique material is based on other sources that we just don't have today. We can't simply just rule that out. But what about John? Does John also just copy from Mark? This is harder to say. John does not use Mark verbatim. John's chronology is quite different, as are his style and content. There are also major events in Mark that are missing from John. In general, scholars have often seen John as being independent. There is currently some move to seeing John as maybe having possibly used Mark as a source, but he didn't rely on it the same way that Matthew and Luke did. In addition, it's supposed that John also had other sources at his disposal. What is clear is that John has many stories in it that are not found in Mark. To make the claim that John just copied Mark or rewrote Mark is not supported by the actual evidence. Such a statement ignores virtually all the scholarship on the subject and at the same time demeans the practice of using sources, which seems silly.
Non-Christian sources are ultimately either fabricated, like with Josephus, or they just regurgitate what Christians were claiming at the time.
These are some of the mythicists' favorite arguments. Anything that might disagree with their view is an interpolation or doesn't count because the source was ultimately Christian. Both arguments simply are terrible. First, just because a source is a Christian, that doesn't mean it's not trustworthy. It doesn't mean it's not factual or that it's not legitimate. There's no logic in dismissing such sources. More so, simply claiming that the ultimate source must have been a Christian doesn't actually mean it was a Christian. Generally, such a claim is not based on actual evidence, but it's just assumed. In all, it's just a bad argument. Second, let's actually dive into Josephus. Unlike what many mythicists will claim, the vast majority of scholars accept that Josephus wrote about Jesus. There we have two passages. The first, called the Testimonium Flavium, is in Book 18 of the Antiquities of the Jews and is held to be partially authentic, with a few phrases having been added. The second passage, found in Book 20, is almost universally accepted as being authentic. Let's start with a passage in Book 20. Here, Josephus is talking about the downfall of Ananus, the current high priest. In this passage, in chapter 7, Josephus tells us how Ananus brought forth a number of individuals and sentenced them to death by stoning. We aren't told the reason as to why they were sentenced, besides the vague notion that they were breakers of the law. Among those who were stoned was, quote, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, unquote. James is the only one specifically mentioned here, but we are told that he is just one of a larger group. Now, there are a number of arguments that people have attempted to use in order to discredit this passage. A common one is that it's an interpolation. There's really no evidence for that, though, and instead this passage fits well within the naming conventions that Josephus uses. In large part, there has been a moving away from this position, as the idea that this passage was an interpolation is really just too difficult to maintain. Instead, a more focused approach has been taken, where only the phrase, who was called Christ, is thought to have been added. There are a couple of ways people make this argument. The first is to claim that the passage originally read, the brother of Jesus, whose name was James. The thought is that some Christian scribe added a marginal note that identified this Jesus with Jesus Christ, and that marginal note was then accidentally added to the text, leaving us with the phrase, who was called Christ. Yet, there is zero textual evidence for this claim. We have no textual traditions that have this variation. Now, that's not an insurmountable issue. It could be that the text was later standardized. There are a few issues here, though. One, we have to ask, why would a scribe assume this passage was talking about Jesus? While this passage does mention a Jesus who was the brother of a man named James, that in itself isn't striking. Both Jesus and James were exceptionally common names. Two, this would break with how Josephus introduces people. Having an identifier for individuals was necessary, as people during this time were generally known by a single name. So if we look at Josephus, there are over a dozen different Jesuses who are mentioned throughout the text. In order to make sense of this, identifiers were added. So to say that James is simply the brother of some random Jesus doesn't actually tell us anything. Now, those who make this argument tend to recognize this issue. The way that they work around it is by claiming that, in fact, the passage tells us who this Jesus is. The claim they make is that this Jesus is actually the same Jesus that is mentioned later on in the text, a Jesus ben Damnius. So the claim then is that we have this passage that speaks of this individual who is called the brother of Jesus, and then further down, we are finally told who this Jesus is. Yet, Josephus never works in this manner. If this argument is true, one has to assume that in this one case, Josephus switches up his general tactic in exchange for a method that really makes no sense. Because after all, this would mean that we have no idea who this Jesus is until sometime later when he's actually introduced. To solve this, some have suggested that originally the passage that read, brother of Jesus, also included the identifier ben Damnius. There again is no textual evidence for this, nor does it make sense with what we know about Josephus. We have no other examples where Josephus repeats his identifier for the same person twice in a row. Instead, what we see with Josephus is that he will introduce someone with an identifier and then simply name that person by their name for the rest of the story. So when we look at Josephus, this argument simply doesn't work. Now, 3, if we look at the phrase, who was called Christ, it does not appear to be a Christian phrasing. Part of the reason for this is because it's in past tense, as in, he was, when he was living, called Christ. For Christians, Jesus is Christ. This is what we see in Matthew 1:16, when we have a similar phrase. But instead of being in the past tense, it is said, who is called the Christ. We also see the phrase in Origen's Contra Celsum, but in both cases, the phrase is coming from non-Christians. The first case is from Pilate, where Origen is recounting the situation where Barabbas or Jesus is offered to be freed. Here, Pilate is quoted as saying that Jesus, quote, who is called Christ, unquote. In the second case, Origen is referencing the passage in Josephus. In general, then, this phrasing by Josephus, labeling Jesus as someone who was called Christ, just doesn't appear to be a Christian interpolation. It appears more similar to what someone like Josephus, a non-Christian, would have written. 4. Another argument that is often made here is that this phrase, who is called Christ, is a participle clause, and this should have sparked either a digression or a cross-reference. In essence, the idea is that this sort of phrase would have needed some sort of explanation. This simply is not true, though. We have a number of examples in Josephus where no explanation is ever given. For instance, in Antiquities 14, we are introduced to 10 men who were called the freemen. Why were they called the freemen? No explanation is ever given. We also have a closer example which happens to be in the same book as the James passage. Here, we are told of a Joseph who has become the high priest. Josephus introduces him as Joseph, who was called Cabo. Why is he called Cabo? We have no idea, as it's never explained. 5 and final. Some have objected to the term Christ in general. Similar to the prior point, they say that Josephus either would have had to explain what was meant by Christ, or no one would have understood. That, or Josephus would never have called Jesus the Christ, or the Messiah, because he didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. To the first point, as we have already went over, Josephus doesn't always explain a nickname. They didn't need to be explained, as they were just a nickname. It was how people referred to that person or place. But one may argue that the term Christ would need to be explained, as it appears that Josephus seemed to be attributing some great importance to this Jesus. This is assuming a bit much. We have to realize that Josephus's audience for the antiquities of the Jews was largely Greek-speaking individuals, Gentiles. It wasn't written for the Jewish people, so the term Christ here wouldn't necessarily carry any religious overtones. We also have to realize that the term Christ in general wouldn't have necessarily carried religious overtones. While it could have been used to refer to the Jewish Messiah, it could also refer to just an anointed person, or, as we see in Antiquities Book 8, Section 137, it could also just mean plastered, as in, quote, but the other part up to the roof was plastered, Christon, over, unquote. Now, some may object to this, saying that, hey, well, that would be a silly name. But if we actually just look at Roman and Greek names at the time, this wouldn't really stand out. In fact, if we look at Cicero, his name means chickpea. So we could have names that seem silly to us, but they were still known by that name for whatever reason. Now, even beyond that, if Jesus was known as Christ, as he is portrayed throughout Christian writings that predated Josephus, then using that common identifier would not be out of the ordinary. In fact, we would actually expect Josephus to refer to Jesus in a way that would identify him. So when we put this all together, there really is no legitimate reason to doubt the authenticity of the James passage. This then leads us into the Testimonium Flavium. There is slight more disagreement on this passage, but the vast majority of scholars agree that the text, at its core, is authentic. The argument is generally that a few lines were added later on, but those lines can be identified and removed. I must stress this point, as often mythicists will claim that all scholars see the passage as a forgery. That simply is patently false. While there are a couple relevant scholars who doubt the passage, they are in the severe minority. On the other side of the coin, we actually have more scholars who argue that the entire passage is authentic. So no, one cannot argue that it's a forgery because scholars in general see it as a forgery. That simply is not true. Now, when we look at the TF, the Testimonium Flavium, there are really three lines that are seen as having possibly been added later. They are, quote, if indeed it is necessary to call him a man, unquote, quote, he was the Messiah, unquote, and, quote, for he appeared to them on the third day, living again, the divine prophets having foretold these things and countless other wonderful things about him, unquote. The first line comes right after Jesus is called a wise man. Josephus calling Jesus a wise man wouldn't have been odd. We see Josephus using the term for other people as well, such as Solomon and Daniel. But the qualifier here, if indeed it is necessary to call him a man, appears a bit odd. In fact, it reads just like that, a qualifier. Now, the phrasing itself isn't odd for Josephus. He uses similar phrasings elsewhere. The larger issue is that the line appears to be saying that Jesus was more than just a mere man. This would be awkward for Josephus. Some have argued that the phrasing was meant to be used sarcastically. This is something that Josephus is known for, such as in his work against Appian, where he called Appian the wonderful Appian. He's being sarcastic here. Another great example is when he says Justice of Tiberius was, quote, the most skillful of writers, unquote. The issue was that Josephus hated justice, so it would be possible to see Josephus as being sarcastic here, while basically mocking the idea that Jesus was thought to be divine. The second phrase here, he was the Messiah, often appears a little bit more straightforward. Josephus, as a devout Jew who never became a Christian, would not have seen Jesus as the Messiah. There are a few issues here though. First, the phrasing is a bit clunky. As discussed previously, it is unlikely that a Christian would have phrased this statement in the past tense, as Jesus having had been the Messiah. If a Christian added it, we would expect the phrase to be, he is the Messiah. We also have a similar passage within the James passage, which again connects Jesus with Christ. Further, in the TF, we also see Josephus saying that the tribe of Christians was named after Jesus. This would make sense if Josephus related Jesus with the term Christ. Stripping Christ from this passage makes a connection with Christians a bit odd. But we have more here. So while we have this main tradition about Josephus, we also have variant traditions. For instance, when we look at Jerome's translation, where he brought it into Latin, we see the phrase as being, quote, "He was believed to be Christ," unquote. This fits much more in line with what someone like Josephus would have said. We also have a Syriac variant which states, quote, "It was thought that he was the Christ," unquote. This largely agrees with Jerome's version and again fits better within what we would expect of Josephus. The final line, which goes over the idea that Jesus appeared to his followers alive, this does seem a bit much for Josephus. It would appear as if Josephus was affirming the idea of the resurrection. However, this may actually be a misreading. Instead, one could argue that the proper reading is that instead of appearing alive, it was just that, quote, "It seemed to them that he was alive," unquote. As in, his followers just thought that they had seen Jesus alive. This would not be a confirmation that Jesus had risen, but instead, people simply thinking that they had seen a risen Jesus. This reading is based on the term phahino, which can be used in either sense, as actually appearing or just seemingly to appear. When looking at how Josephus uses this term, when in conjunction with a participle, he seems to prefer the meaning of "it seems to appear," as in it wasn't something that actually occurred, but only seemed to have occurred. For instance, Josephus relates a story of how the brothers of Joseph put blood on his clothes in order to make it appear that Joseph had been killed by beasts. This was in order to deceive the boy's father, Jacob. Now, for those familiar with the story of Joseph, we know that he was not actually killed, but had been sold. In this context, this reading would make sense as a belief in the resurrection is what caused individuals to continue following Jesus, and what eventually led to Christianity. Reporting this idea, while not confirming that it happened, fits within what Josephus was doing. But let's ignore these three passages and go with the consensus that these three lines were added later on. The rest of the passage is very Josephian. If we break the TF down line by line, we can find numerous parallels within other passages in Josephus's writings, as in the language and style that is present in the TF is also what we would expect of Josephus. A number of the phrases also appear to be more likely to be uttered by Josephus than by a proposed Christian forger. Now, the thing we have to remember with a potential forger is they would have had to add the forgery to Josephus rather late. Most who take this view tend to cite Eusebius as the potential forger, and this would be the time period that we really would have to look at. With that in mind, in the TF, we have the phrase, quote, "And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of the Greek origin," unquote. This may not seem like much to begin with, but there is really only a short amount of time that this idea would have even been relevant. If we look at the development of Christianity, it began as a Jewish sect. The earliest followers are Jews. In fact, Jesus tells his followers not to go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. It's not until after Jesus died that the movement really began to go out to the Greeks, while also being a Jewish mission. Now, that said, we do have some Gentiles who do appear in the Gospels, but they are a minority. Now, this would change sometime in the early 2nd century when we see Judaism and Christianity splitting. Most scholars point to the First Jewish War and the fall of the temple as one of the catalysts here, and often suppose that by the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the division had largely been finalized. After this, the movement was primarily a Gentile one. By the time of Eusebius, the supposed forger, Christianity was a Gentile religion where Judaism was largely seen as hostile. It then makes more sense to assume Josephus wrote that Jesus attracted many followers among Jews and Greeks than it does for a later writer. Even though the earliest Jesus movement was probably just Jewish, within years of his death, it was attracting both Jews and Greeks, and this is the environment Josephus would have known. In the TF, we also have a much more positive approach to the Jewish leadership. Josephus mentions the Jewish leaders here as, quote, "the principal men among us," unquote. Later Christian writing became increasingly anti-Jewish, to the point where the Jewish leaders are actually the villains. Beyond this, we have other reasons to believe that the TF is at least partially authentic. If the TF was an interpolation, then the placement in Antiquities is odd. The reason for that is that it comes before the passage on John the Baptist. One would assume that if someone was going to add a passage to Jesus into Josephus, they would keep the Christian chronology, which places Jesus after John. In fact, even when Eusebius is giving his summary on the Christian origins, he first cites the John the Baptist passage in Josephus, and then he cites the TF. If Eusebius is doing the interpolation, why wouldn't he have just placed the TF after John if that's how he was going to use it anyways? Now, one of the arguments against the authenticity is that the TF supposedly interrupts the flow of the surrounding passages. This is one argument that I've never really understood. If one is familiar with Josephus, this choppy-like flow is characteristic of his writing. It also isn't uncommon for Josephus to add short little biographies into his work that are often self-contained. When we look at John the Baptist, we see another similar aside. We see this as well with the account of the Egyptian prophet, as well as the magician named Theudius. Often, these little self-contained biographies do relate to the surrounding texts, and we also see that with the TF. Prior to the TF, Josephus finishes one story that features Pilate. We then have the TF, which would have happened in the same general time frame and also deals with Pilate. Then following the TF, we have another new story that features a calamity among the Jews. This is characteristic of the abrupt flow of Josephus. He tells a story, it ends, and then he jumps into something new. Often there's some overall thematic link, but often we also see self-contained stories being added as well. Another argument levied against authenticity is that no one seems to be aware of the TF until the 3rd century. This is true, but it's also very misleading. Alice Wheely, in Josephus on Jesus, traces the use of Josephus's Antiquities and shows that it really isn't until the 3rd century that it's used in any way, meaning the TF isn't used until the 3rd century because Antiquities wasn't used until the 3rd century. The first person to really utilize Antiquities was Eusebius, who focused on Christian history. After the author of Luke and Acts, Eusebius is often seen as the second church historian. Now, Eusebius isn't the first to mention Antiquities though. That would most likely go to Origen. Origen doesn't properly cite Antiquities, but it's clear that he references the James passage, and he states that Josephus did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. What should be apparent though is that it really isn't a surprise that the TF isn't mentioned, because the Antiquities in general isn't mentioned. It was a set of works that just wasn't on anyone's radar. But when the TF is finally mentioned, how is it used? If we take the mythicist position that it was a forgery, one would assume that it was used in order to prove Jesus existed or bolster him in some way, but that assumption would be incorrect. While Eusebius cites the TF 3 times, he never uses the more pro-Christian claims. Instead, he uses it in regards to chronological claims and to show that Jesus had many disciples. In fact, we don't see any early references to the TF that actually highlight the pro-Christian claims. It's not used to suggest that he was truly the Messiah, and in fact, Origen specifically states that Josephus did not think Jesus was the Messiah. They don't use it to suggest that he was divine or overly special. When it is used, it's used in a rather mundane manner. Now, just some final points. Some argue that Eusebius forged the TF because we see similarities in his writings with Josephus. This is expected, as Eusebius uses Josephus quite often. He certainly was going to pick up on at least a few things or phrases. However, the TF also matches with Josephus. At best, then, we can say that Josephus influenced Eusebius. We also have to recognize that Josephus isn't necessarily getting all of his information secondhand. He was a Jew associated with priests and high priests. He was from a respectable family living in Jerusalem. It's quite likely that he was present, or at least knew people who were present, during the incidents with James, where James is killed. It's also very probable that he would have known something about Christians, as the center of their church was in Jerusalem, with James, Peter, and John. It's also known that Josephus was acquainted with individuals, or at least families, who would have been involved with the priesthood and Sanhedrin during the time of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying we can know what his sources are, but what I am saying is that we can't simply claim that his sources must have been Christian. After all, Josephus would have had many connections here, and again, it is probable that he knew of the James incidents firsthand. So we need to be careful on what we assume about his sources. Now, I'm sure that I will address Josephus many more times in the future, but I think for now, this really covers most of the bases. Let's finally move on.
The early church fathers like Papias, Justin Martyr, and others were not concerned with the historical nature of Christianity.
This is completely accurate. After the author of Luke Acts, we don't see another Christian historian until Eusebius. The main focus, which we also see in Paul, is on theology. We have a new religion emerging, and there's a lot of questions that are being asked and need answering. Based on this, we can assume that the historicity of Jesus just really isn't an issue. The history of Jesus is rather firm, so it doesn't need to be addressed time and time again. I'm not fully certain how this lends itself to the mythicist position, though.
As far as we know through Paul's epistles, nobody was ever a disciple. They were only ever apostles, which meant that they had received a vision of the resurrected Jesus and not experienced Jesus before his death.
It's rather deceptive to say that Paul never recognized disciples and only said that there were apostles. A big issue here is a misrepresentation of what an apostle was. An apostle, by definition, is one who was sent forth. It does not imply that they had never met Jesus or only had a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Not every apostle was defined by the experience of Paul. Now, it is true Paul does not use the term disciple. There could be a variety of reasons for this. There were no new disciples as Jesus had already passed. He could have been attempting to put everyone more on an even level by claiming that they were all apostles. Also, by this time, it appears that disciples had taken on a new identifier. We get this most clearly in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, which is part of a tradition that has been handed down to Paul. Here, we are told of the death and resurrection of Jesus and how Jesus first appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. He then appears to more than 500, and then to James, then to all of the apostles. Here, we have a clear separation between Cephas and the 12 and the apostles. A distinction is being made here, with Cephas and the 12 being given a sense of importance. What's clear here is that Paul does in fact mention the disciples. He just doesn't use the term disciples. Now, one could possibly argue that Paul doesn't specifically say that they are disciples, and the only way that we would know this is if we assume information from the Gospels. If, for the sake of argument, we assume that, it's still clear that Paul doesn't argue that the only thing that we have are apostles. Whatever this group of 12 were, they were still distinct from the apostles. But there is no reason why we shouldn't assume some information from the Gospels. The Gospels also, independently of Paul, mention a group of 12, and in this case, we are told they are disciples of Jesus. There is no reason why we can't make this connection. Beyond that, we are told by Paul in Galatians 1:17 that there were apostles before him. Paul never tells us what their qualifications were or how they became apostles. He never mentions if these individuals knew Jesus or not, or if all they had was some vision. Paul never provides some formula as to how one was deemed an apostle. In fact, going back to 1 Corinthians 15:5, Paul actually gives us reason to suspect that his apostleship was somewhat unique. Why? Because he doesn't include himself with, quote, all the apostles, unquote. Instead, he places himself singularly at the end. He makes a distinction between him being an apostle and the other apostles. To assume that Paul's apostleship was standard, that his experience defined how one became an apostle, simply is not supported in the text. And in fact, we have good reason to assume that Paul's experience was not common.
All the evidence lies with Paul and what he thought about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection.
The idea that all that we can rely on is Paul is rather unreasonable. largely because the argument that gets one to this point, as we have already seen, is flawed. The idea that the Gospels are dependent on Paul simply is not supported, and thus we can't simply rule them out. With that said, there is something we can say about Paul. Paul knew James, the brother of Jesus. If someone has a brother, that is exceptionally good evidence that person existed. More so, it tells us that this person lived in the recent past. It is in Galatians 1:18 through 19 that we are told that Paul had met, quote, James, the Lord's brother, unquote. Now we have multiple sources that affirm that Jesus had brothers, and one of them was named James. Both the Gospels and Josephus confirm this basic idea. Yet, some mythicists argue that Paul here doesn't actually mean a literal brother, but instead that they were brothers in a figurative sense. It is true that Paul at times does use the term brother in a more broad sense in order to include fellow believers. But in Galatians, we can't assume that is what Paul is saying. The phrase we see in Galatians is ton adelphon tu kurio, the brother of the Lord. There is only one other place we see a similar version of this, 1 Corinthians 9:3 through 6, where we see it in its plural form, hoi adelphoi tu kurio, the brothers of the Lord. Now, besides having a distinctive form in both passages, reading brother figuratively makes no sense. This is more clearly seen in the 1 Corinthians passage, which reads, quote, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, unquote. The brothers of the Lord are distinct here from other fellow believers, such as the apostles or Cephas. This same distinction is found in Galatians, where James, being a brother of the Lord, is seen as distinct from other fellow believers. Paul clearly makes a distinction here. He makes it clear that Jesus had actual brothers by separating them from other believers and by using a distinct phrase for them. They are not figurative brothers, but actual, literal brothers. The fact that Jesus was known to have literal brothers who were still living at the time of Paul is possibly the best evidence that not only did Paul see Jesus as someone having lived here on earth just a short while before, but that Jesus most definitely existed. And this point, that James was literally the brother of Jesus, is attested to in multiple independent sources.
Whenever Paul refers to Jesus' birth, he uses words that are more indicative of manufactured rather than birthed.
Paul does not imply Jesus was manufactured. The term that Paul uses in regards to the birth of Jesus is ginomai. It can mean a variety of things based on context. On a basic level, it means to become. However, one could also translate it as to be made or a few other things based on context. It's also often used to refer to birth. For instance, we see this in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, in places like Genesis 4:18, quote, and to Enoch was born, unquote, as well in Genesis 21:3, quote, and a son was born to Abraham, unquote. Both verses use the verb ginomai. We also see it used in the same manner in non-biblical writings, such as Herodotus' Histories 191, quote, a male child was born to him, unquote, or in Philo, Confusion of Tongues 14, quote, a child was born to him, unquote. So Paul isn't doing anything novel here. He describes the birth of Jesus in a manner that was rather common, using a verb that often refers to being born, a verb that is used throughout Greek writing to mean just this. To suggest that Paul himself is suggesting Jesus was manufactured means one has to ignore the fact that the term ginomai is often used to refer to birth. It is nothing more than special pleading. So that is where we'll leave off on this video. We will continue this discussion forward as we go more into this idea of manufacturing and to a variety of different ideas. Now, if you like this type of material, give me a like, give me a comment, subscribe, do whatever. The fact is, I'm going to continue making this stuff anyway, so hopefully someone enjoys it. But until next time, have a great day and keep on being curious.